Hi, my name is Jerry Levy, and I want to welcome you all to this commemorative conference on the work of Joseph Bensman and Arthur Vidich. We're particularly honored tonight to have members of both families, friends, collaborators, colleagues, students, and other people who have been influenced by the work of these two intellectuals. I want to mention a number of people who would have liked to attend, but for various reasons were not. Robert Jackal, Jose Casanova, Larry Carney, Charlotte O'Kelly, Harry Doms, Doyle McCarthy, Guy Oakes, Peter Cavisto, David Kettles, Jack Cameraman, Nick Alex, and I'm sure many others, so I apologize in advance for not mentioning them. I want to pay particular thanks to Philip Kasinitz, the chair of the Department of Sociology at the City University, and Rate Kalip, the department assistant, who so graciously gave us this beautiful venue to partake. And I want to also particularly thank the other organizers of the conference, besides myself, C.J. Churchill, my collaborator and friend, who we participated together in every decision that was made about the conference, Charles Vidich, eldest son of Arthur, who has a wonderful blog, who did outreach to find and communicate with people, who made marvelous suggestions and technical communication suggestions. Laurin Raiken, who also did the same, who gave me and CJ entree to people we did not know. So, just want to say that we will be having breakfast Saturday morning and Sunday morning at the Murray Hill Diner, and Saturday night, for those of you who have not made dinner plans, we're going to be at the Crooked Knife. So we hope to see you there. The purpose of the conference, of course, is to come to grips, to try and assess, to revisit the legacy of two very important 20th century intellectuals from a number of perspectives. The work they did together, the work they did individually, and the work they did with so many collaborators. The influence they had on students. And so the purpose of this conference is to come to terms with all of that. And we will attempt to do that in the Saturday and Sunday morning session. But tonight, the session will be devoted to more personal affairs, memories. We hope everyone will have something to say about Arthur or Joe or both. And we will have a wonderful slideshow by Charles Vidich. So, without further ado, as they say in Britain, let's get cracking.
Well, good evening. My name is Charles Vidich, and I'm Arthur Vidich's eldest son. My brother Joe is here. I'm not sure if my brother Paul will be coming, but on behalf of my family, I want to thank CJ and Jerry and Kaylee, everybody else who made this possible. A really extraordinary effort. It's great, Jerry, for all the work you've done here. And you're part of his life. So, oh, there's my brother Paul. He finally showed up. Good to see you, Paul.
Finally?
Yeah. Well, we wondered about you.
These chairs are cheaper up here.
Yeah, come right up front. Come right up front.
I don't want to get too...
It would be impossible to talk about my father without also talking about his three sisters. His three sisters were central to his charm, to his style, and to actually his skills as a participant observer. And you'll see here Pauline, Olga, and Betty, his three sisters. And of course, this was a picture taken on their car back when they had a speakeasy in Milwaukee. So they made their living in a way that was typical of that era, actually. Now, for those of you who don't know, my father was educated in a variety of ways, but the School of Hard Knocks, this is the School of Hard Knocks. He got his education in the Marine Corps. And for those of you who don't know, for many years, my father had on his resume, in the same location as his Harvard PhD, his military training in post-World War II in the pacification of the Japanese military. He considered that to be as important as any part of his education. Not necessarily the flame-throwing part of it, but obviously those things were part of his education. But a chance encounter he had meeting Virginia Vidich one weekend totally changed his life. This chance encounter was a trip which he went from Parris Island, South Carolina, up to New York City. It was a time of gas rationing, so he's good. He made it halfway there. But the other half is to get back. Well, with gas rationing, he never made it back, and he went AWOL. And from being a lieutenant, or a machine gun instructor at Parris Island, which is a cushy job, going AWOL sent him over to Iwo Jima. So, three things that were important in that experience. Going to Iwo Jima never happened because the boat broke down, but he ended up in the first invasion force of Japan, and his experience in opening up the concentration camps, the POW camps, and the experience of demilitarizing the Japanese and seeing the condition of the Japanese was a turning point in his life. It probably is summarized by this picture. This was the defining moment, in my opinion, of his life. He actually took this photo because he was a procurement officer in the Marine Corps, and as a result, he commandeered a Piper Cub, went up there, and really took the first photos that were taken of Nagasaki. 1 year after returning from Japan, he went to Palau, and in between, he was at the University of Wisconsin. And that's where he had his experience in terms of really participant observation work and his study of the Palauan culture, and which was the basis for his PhD. And this was Mr. Ritzenthaler in the center, and Harry Mahoney, which is the University of Chicago grad student, going native in Palau. Now, a little bit about his teachers. A lot of people don't know a lot about his teachers, but these are the teachers he had at the University of Wisconsin. Some of you may know Hans Gerth, but the individual on the left, who's John Hussein, is the individual who actually selected him to be on the trip to Palau. And these are the professors that he had in that period of time. And really the ones that had the most influence, obviously, if you know, it was Hans Gerth. But really John Hussein was the one who had the most influence on his career at that point in time in terms of setting up his opportunity to go to Palau. Again, after coming back from Palau, finishing his work at the University of Wisconsin, he went on to Harvard, and these are the 11 professors he had. Of these 11 professors, Talcott Parsons over here and Clyde Kluckhohn are the two who had the most influence upon him. Now, he'll never say that, but there's two kinds of influences, ones that are positive and negative. And those influences drove him in his career. You can look through his literature and you'll find all kinds of references to Kluckhohn and to Parsons. So one way or the other, there's the affirmative and there's the negative. But those two individuals strongly influenced his thought processes. Now, Joe Bensman and Art Vidich went back to the days of 1942. In fact, I went through the University of Wisconsin alumni, or their, I guess, the student annual report, and I found pictures of Arthur and Joe in the same various groups. So I said, wow, this is amazing. It's all documented in photography that the two of them were connected way back in the early 40s. But specifically in 1951, when my father was in Yugoslavia, Joe asked my father if he would do a study of the radio listening habits of the Yugoslavs. So it's really a study in propaganda on the part of the Voice of America, yet it was really another study in which Joe and Art connected. In this case, Joe was the one paying Art, and they went back and forth in terms of these relationships. But this was a very important study, and it's only this year that that study has actually been released in the New School Archives. I've asked them to put it up, and they did, and they now have an executive summary of that study for those of you who are interested in that particular work. Obviously, the small town and mass society was kind of the key work that both Art and Joe did. No one can talk about their careers without talking about that book. It sold an enormous number of copies. In fact, I know 80,000 is not the real number. That's only the number that Princeton was willing to give us, because there was a Doubleday anchor version right here, which sold hundreds of thousands, really, but we never can get that number. Up until 1957, my father was at the University of Puerto Rico. Then 1960, he left after 3 years at the University of Connecticut. And then during the 60s, he had a grueling routine. He was visiting professor all over the place, Clark University and various other places. And then he worked for Joe Bensman at William Esty. I remember because he used to be doing these various market research studies, and I occasionally would accompany him and listen to various versions of Kent cigarette advertisements to see how people react. And I said, wow. It's amazing, just a few little words here or there, and you can sell it to anybody. I said, I was very impressed with the technology that they had. Madison Avenue was so far ahead of everybody else. Of course, you can't talk about art without talking about collaboration. And collaboration was really virtually all he did with his students, his colleagues, his mentors. And he started with his wife in collaborating on the book, or his dissertation was on At the Crossroads. My mother also did a dissertation at the Crossroads too. So I said, nobody's ever talked about this, but the two of them collaborated on this work, and it's never been talked about. Everyone knows that my father wrote something about the Crossroads. Nobody knows my mother wrote the same stuff, but earlier than my father. So the two of them actually had worked together in one fashion or another in that area. But as you can see, Joe Bensman, Maury Stein, Ron Glassman, Stan Lyman, Mike Hughey, who's here, Guy Oakes, and Bob Jackal. And those are just the major players. There were a number of other people that my father collaborated with in earlier phases of his career. But I'd say one thing that was very dear to my father was the New School in its history of the intellectuals in exile. He himself identified with that particular philosophy because he really looked at himself as an outsider. And for that reason, I think for him, this was a very important event. And as far as colleagues, while he had far more colleagues than this, I do want to give attention to Joe, to Maury Stein, and to Stan Lyman, the three at the bottom, as being very important. And obviously his colleagues are vast, but I wanted to bring attention to them. Maury is the only one who's still alive, and Jerry and I spent a week or one day with him up in Cambridge talking about his life and his legacy, which was wonderful. And we videotaped it and did an audio tape of it. It was great. He wanted to actually participate, but he's like 95 and couldn't make it. But Herbert Blumer, Hans Gerth, and Thorsten Veblen, to say the least. I'd put Machiavelli in there too as one of his mentors, but that goes back a few years. So, students of Arthur, and of course, I'd like to add those of you who are not here, as shown, but I'm putting the ones that I have photographs for. That's Virginia Betancourt, the daughter of the president of Venezuela, who was a close friend of my father's. Ira Glazer there, who is New York Civil Liberties Union. Some of the others I think you know. Bill Earlbaum, who is the Supreme Court Justice in New York State. And last but not least, I had to show Jerry Levy in his library, because he had such a nice library up there. And that was from our visit last year. Obviously, my father had a lot of ideas, but I think his interest in the so-called field of objectivity of the social sciences, or the lack thereof, was a big theme in his work, and I think also his study of bureaucracies and its impact on American life were important to him. But there's an enormous number of others, including, I'd say probably the most timely right now is his interest in legitimacy, governmental legitimacy, which is probably one of the most unifying themes of all the papers I read so far for this conference. So I've always thought that, you could summarize people with a few words, and I took the effort to do it, and you'll have your own. I'd call him a participant observer, charming, generous. He was an editor, a gardener, fatherly, mentor, Veblenite, Keynesian, collaborator, and beyond isms. and of course, you can come up with your own, but I decided that at least it gives you my flavor for things. And of all these publications, it's only the first two that are uniquely my father's work. And even those were not uniquely my father's work, but when you look at the cover, it has only his name on it. All the others, as you'll see, these are the two that he did. Before he did the political impact of colonial administration, it was political factionalism, which is a study he did for the National Science Foundation. That study is not available anywhere. I was able to buy it online through some used bookstore. And it's a different study entirely. It was done for the National Science Foundation, but there are some similarities. But the rest of these are the books that he wrote with his colleagues and his friends. You'll see there's an enormous number of people, and Nabucco Girth is on this list too. There's a whole series, by the way, for those who didn't know, and neither did I until the last 6 months, of the main trends of the modern world. I thought at one point there was only 4 or 5 of these, but the more we've been digging, there's like 9 books in this series on the modern trends. Here's Guy Oakes, and then one in Franco Ferrotti, is put together in Italian. And just a few from his high school days, after he graduated from the Marine Corps, 46, in Palau, again in Palau, with his kids in Puerto Rico, in Candor, New York, with Andrew after he's only a couple months old, and art on a trip with Joe over in the corner there, up in the Canadian wilds with his wife Mary. Andrew in his wild motorcycle days, and Alan, that's the guy who really rode the motorcycle, not me, our brother Andrew. And of course, here's 2 pictures. This one in particular is how a lot of people remember him.
In the field, and don't mind how many children of the speakers are addressing, but Miriam Bensman, Joe Bensman's youngest And I want to tell a funny story, what David didn't know, and then just some reflections about Joe and Art's friendship that I saw all my life. So the juvenile delinquency and why Dad was almost sent to reform school was that my dad joined a little gang of kids when he was about 13, and it was the year after his mother died. And the kids were stealing ball bearings off of trains, freight trains that were stopping in the station en route to someplace else. And they would sell them to the guy in town who had the hardware store, which was the biggest store in this town of 10,000. And I think what Dad said was that they would sell them to him for 2 cents each, and he would sell them in the store for 5 cents. And the boys decided they were getting ripped off, and they said that they should get 3 cents. And the store owner got really angry, and he got so angry that he turned them into the police, even though that doesn't make any sense because he was fencing their goods. And what Dad said was the reason that he wasn't sent to reform school was twofold. One of them was that one of the other boys in this gang of hoodlums, or thieves, or whatever they were, was his father was on the city council. And the other reason was that the store owner was the biggest businessman in town, and it really would have been a big scandal. So they hushed the whole thing up. And that was part of his introduction to the corruption in small town America, which is so widely idealized in our society. So, and that's what he brought to small town. So I am not, however, an academic. I'm not a sociologist or a historian like my brother. And I'm not going to talk about the content of my father's work. I thought as I was listening to Charlie speak that I would like to talk a little bit about their friendship because I started to remember so much. Both of my parents had a lot of friends that they kept for 40 or 50 years sometimes, but I don't remember anybody that my dad was as close to as Art. We stayed in your homes and stores. I know that they stayed in that place in Puerto Rico, but I didn't go because I was a fetus. I did go, but I didn't see it. We stayed in the house in Tupper Lake, and I was 3 or 4. We visited a lot in Bedford Street. I don't remember the place in Fort Greene. I went out a lot to the place on in Southampton. We stayed. I spent one Christmas vacation in Sarasota when your dad was teaching down there. Art visited us when we were traveling in Spain. There was a week we were in Marbella and did a little traveling in the south, the area there, and I think they were working on New American Society then, or is that too early? I'm not sure. So it was very present in my life in a very vivid way, and I think that it was a mixed, that no friendship is pure. I think there was competition and some resentment, and I guess even though Art's early career seems like there was some unemployment and jumping around, he was teaching almost the whole time, except for when my dad got him to do some study at the Voice of America. But my dad was out of sociology for about 15 years. And although that provided him with a lot of rich field work that he wrote about, you know, it was almost, in a way, art did him a favor by saying, I mean, it was mutual, right? Art was having trouble doing the theoretical part of the work. This fabulous field research that and Dad was better at the theoretical stuff, so they put that together. And, you know, so there was some resentment, but there was also a lot of visiting. And, I mean, I did a lot of fishing with Art and my dad, and a lot of cribbage playing. That somehow they found this game that they had played as boys, I think, in Wisconsin, and had lost, and a lot of drinking and a lot of disapproval of things. You know, I think my dad didn't approve of when your parents got divorced, but then they became very good friends with Mary, and I mean, I felt in some ways that Art was another uncle. He gave a very beautiful talk at my dad's funeral, which he gave me the copy of, and I have no idea where it was. Although what I remember most vividly from it was the sense that he gave that my dad was never appreciated enough in sociology, and the way I heard it said was that somehow Parsons was, when American sociology was the dominant thing, and Dad was always the outsider. And I think that Art was also talking about himself. They were, they gardened. I mean, you know, Dad gardened and then Art had the garden out in Southampton, and it was, you know, it was very nice. And I don't know how much those of you who were their students saw those sides of them. I mean, Dad did, my father certainly let his students into his life a lot. I mean, there were all these people that were always sitting at our dining room table in the back room, working with him, as well as Art and other people. So just so you can put some human face on who they were.
Thank you.
Wow.
Anyway, I'm Joe Vidich. I'm the youngest of the 4 Vidich boys. And I'm going to say a few things about, well, in following Miriam's comments about Art and Joe, and it's actually Virginia and Marilyn, the 2 wives, actually knew each other really well. And that was one of the reasons I think the divorce was hard, because there was a great story, actually, that your mother told me about my mother. She goes, they were at a party at the University of Wisconsin, and it was a big snowstorm, and they had to walk like 2 miles from, I don't know, some building to some other building. And my mother had high heels on, and what your mother said was she took those high heels off and she just ran, you know, and in the snow, and to get back to where she was. And anyway, so they had a very, very close relationship, and I think that's one of the reasons that the 2 families were so close. You know, one of the things I do remember when the Bensmans showed up, it was always bagels, smoked whitefish, creamed herring. You know, there's just, you know, and people ask me, why do you like this stuff? And I was like, you're not Jewish. And I mean, you couldn't get it where we lived. You know, it's like at Stores, Connecticut, or, you know, wherever we were, it was like these things. But they brought them up from, you know, New York or you know, wherever they were. But, you know, they brought the best food. It was, and I do remember them working together. Those two, Joe and Art, had this great, you know, interaction. And you know, it's funny. You know, Joe was extremely irreverent and had a phenomenal sense of humor. His sarcasm just kind of flowed out, and it's like I actually I kind of think that's where my sarcastic sense of humor has come from. Is really it's because my father really, his sense of humor was, he didn't really have, he was sort of easy going, but Joe was just sharp. I mean, it's like he'll nail you. I'd walk in the room and he'd see what I was wearing, whatever it was. And I said, so I soon learned how to respond to him, and it was fun. It was always a pleasure to see them. And my father developed close relationships with a lot of his students as well as collaborators and colleagues, and they really became part of the family. So, many of you here, Jerry Levy, Laurin Raiken, Mike Hughey. I mean, Mike Hughey, I thought he was younger than me. He always looked younger than me, but it's like it must have been when I was around 24 or something, or 25 when Mike first showed up on the scene, and he was, he looked younger. He definitely was. And I was like, but he was like all of a sudden part of the family. I mean, it was great. It was, Art had this way of, he took tremendous interest in his students, making sure, they finished their PhDs and they got work and they got a job. That was, I mean, he really, he sweated, writing letters, trying to network, find out where he could place people. And, he wasn't always happy where he placed somebody, but, the idea was that, if they were going to be in this field, they were going to get a job. I mean, that was really, and there was a period of time where, he was just disgusted with the whole university system, that, they weren't willing to pay. But, that was, we always got, sort of the general what's going on in the field as you sit at the dinner table. And actually, I remember when the new school was having major problems, and I guess they were on the verge of being decertified, whatever. I came home from college, and it seemed like my father had aged 10 years, because suddenly, not that he had any hair, but it went gray. He just looked, and I think it was a couple of years where he really was under a tremendous amount of pressure to make sure the new school made it through. I guess it was probably around 1976 or something, 75, 76. The state was looking into whether or not they were going to certify the program, the graduate program. There's a few other people that, I'd like to mention who, they had an impact in my life. I mean, when I, listening to these very smart people, sitting around a dinner table, people who are not here, like Godehard Chernik, and David Goddard, and Stan Lyman. Obviously, Stan Lyman, was around for quite some time, and he actually filled a hole in my father's life when Joe Bensman died. I mean, there was definitely a big hole there that somebody who was his his intellectual equal. I think they were both probably, they were more theorists. Both of those guys were more, Joe Bensman and Stan Lyman, I think, had a much more theoretical outlook on the world. But anyway, that filled a real hole for my father, and it gave him his joy, his professional joy, working with them. The other thing I was going to say is, growing up in an intellectual household, you're listening to these conversations. You're 5 years old, right? You don't understand half the words, right? It's, but what you do understand is all of these people sounded like they knew what they were talking about, right? So one of the things I learned is that as you get older, you have to sound like you know what you're talking about. You may not know what you're talking about. And my kids, later on in life, they say, Dad, you really don't know what you're talking about. So I got part of it down, you're there, and you almost feel like you're being given a lecture you are giving a lecture, because you really can't add anything to these conversations in your 12, 13, 14, 17. You still haven't read those books. And, you're still not going to read them either. In fact, when I was in graduate school, my father did, he said, so what's your reading list? I gave him my reading list. He read them all. I think I got to half of them. It was like, it was very interesting growing up with an intellectual as a father. He also had his other side, which was, and he definitely was, a warm person and, very generous. And, he showed that with, his family and everybody he worked with, I think that's about all I have to say.
CJ.
First, I'll just echo Jerry's comments to say thank you all for coming to this, because we organized it, but it wouldn't be anything if people weren't here. So it's really meaningful that you all made it, and through the weekend too. I guess I knew Arthur for about, I didn't know Joseph Bensman, but I knew Arthur for about 8 years maybe. And my thoughts about him, just on this personal set of reflections tonight, are sort of three categories: style, humor, and generosity. And before I met him, I'd read his books with Jerry. And, I just knew him as a person who had written these books, and I was really taken with them. And I have all sorts of marginal comments that I wrote when I was 19 in these books that I'm now embarrassed to read. But the way I actually met him was at Marlborough College, where I studied with Jerry. You have to write a senior thesis, and an outside examiner has to come in and evaluate your work. And so Arthur was my outside examiner. And so I first met him on campus. I was kind of starstruck. It was almost like I was meeting a celebrity, which I think he was probably very amused by, that notion that I would feel like I was meeting somebody who was in the star system. And when I was examined, I didn't actually get to do it on campus. We had to come down here to the new school. And so Jerry and my other plan sponsor and I drove down from Vermont, and we came to his office in the old clothing department store on Fifth Avenue. And I had never really encountered American sociology outside of this little campus on a hill in Vermont in Jerry's office. And so this was really my first exposure to the wider world of American sociology by meeting Arthur Vidich and actually having this examination in his office. And afterward, he showed me this file that he said, this is my journal that I created with my friend Joseph Bensman. And then we went out to dinner afterward, the four of us. And I had already begun to imagine that I might become a sociologist. And I thought, here's this really suave, stylish guy who was so smart. And I remember walking it was a warm day, we were walking from the new school to some Indian restaurant, and he had this linen suit on, this Panama hat, and he had written these great books, and I thought, oh, that's, I guess that's what sociologists are. It's a very strange idea what a sociologist would be, but there was something very impressive about him just in his persona and his, what I felt to be a sort of innate humor. And it was sometime around then, maybe it was a year later or something, I was talking to him at maybe it was the Veblen conference, and we were out afterwards. And I was saying some stupidly naive thing about how politicians must be admirable people. They've made it up to this high level of stature, and they've worked so hard to get there, something that a 21-year-old might say. And he said to me, I won't use the exact words, he said, you don't think when the American president meets the Italian prime minister's wife, he doesn't get turned on? And I thought, oh, that's really funny that he would be so blunt about this. He used other language, which I appreciate. And then some years later, probably 7 years later, I was out at his house in Southampton. Jerry and Mary and Arthur and I were sitting out on the patio, and I had begun teaching in this real sociology job, which is 4-4 teaching load, and students who were there for a credential, not the life of the mind that I had imagined. And I said to him, oh, this one of these students was really effusive in her praise of my class. I said, I was so happy about that. And he sort of looked at me with a half smile and he said, you know, you're grading her. And I thought, oh. And he said, yeah, there's a reason why she's saying that. And I thought, well, why didn't I realize this? You know, of course there's, but he always had that way about him of seeing the flip side of things, I think, that was both there in his personal sense of humor and also in a deeply serious way in his writing, I think, throughout all of his work. But just to touch on, so that was style and humor, and the last category is generosity. And so when I was applying to graduate schools, I applied to a few places. The New School is one of them. I ended up going to Brandeis University, but I really wanted to go to the New School to study with Arthur. And I'd started to become friends with people who were studying with him. And the New School offered me, I think, half the money that Brandeis offered me in the fellowship. And it was just going to be too much of a strain to do it. And so I was on the phone with Arthur talking about this. I was astounded that he said to me, well, look, if you come to the New School, I'll pay you to be my assistant. And he meant, I'm pretty sure out of his own pocket, that he was willing to pay me something to be his assistant, to come and study there. And I was really deeply moved by it. I had to go to Brandeis for a variety of reasons, one of which is just the sheer financial difference in the fellowship. But that always left a mark on me, that he was willing to personally put himself out of his way to make my education better and to allow for me to study with him. Some years later, after I'd gotten my PhD and I was facing just, this decimated job market for sociology. There's nothing out there, right? Unless you're already publishing in American Journal of Sociology with derivative data from quantitative data sets. So that wasn't who I was. And so I was having trouble finding a job, getting interviews. And I was talking to Arthur about it over a series of a couple of phone calls. And he said, look, there's, I think it was Suffolk County Community College. And he knew the person who was chair of the department. And he said, I'm sure we can get you an adjunct position out here, and you can stay with Mary and me several days a week, have a key to the back door and live with us. And I thought, again, this was kind of an amazing level of generosity that I'd done nothing to earn. And all that time through graduate school and then during my dissertation process and after my dissertation, anything I wrote, I would often send it to him. And I'd never officially been his student, but I would just get copious notes back. And I'm sure now I look back and I'm a little bit embarrassed about how much I sent to him. He was under no obligation to respond to it, but he responded generously every time, critically and supportively. And so finally, the last thing that I was thinking about in terms of his generosity was what you were saying about he tried to place his students in jobs. And actually, when I finished at Brandeis, I did manage to get a job right out of the gate, and it was at Williams College. But it wasn't really a job; it was a visiting position that was about a semester. It could have gone on for 2 semesters. And the reason for the job, I'm sure, was because Arthur probably talked to Bob Jackal, who was going on sabbatical, and then Bob reached out to me, and I went for an interview, and then I had this visiting position, which, in reading Arthur's memoir, you begin to see that's how he got jobs, and he was really trying to take care of me as he would any of his students. And I think he said at some point to Jackal, thanks, Bob, for getting CJ a job. And Jackal said, it's not a job. And I say, well, for what it's worth. So anyway, this is just some of my thoughts about Arthur. Okay.
If I ramble a bit or whatever, my main point is that Arthur Vidich was my dissertation advisor in around the late 80s. And I'm just really grateful it was him. And that really is changed a lot of things in my life. So I'll start like this, that I have to go back. I wrote about music and being a musician and playing in a lot of bars and lounges. And that was what I did for a living. And then studied sociology and somehow went out of these two worlds, which were very different, and the people were very different. And there was a certain point in playing music where I wasn't making enough money, and I had 3 children, and I was seeing this therapist because I was trying to book more work in these bars. And the therapist, and also I left the new school because I failed the qualifying exam. And I said, well, hell with this, I'm just going to play music forever. The therapist got me back into the new school, which also changed my mind about psychology and sociology being at ends with each other. You know, oh, you can't say something about Freud because they'll kill you, you know. You can, I mean, I don't know why that's... Anyway, this person got me back. And then, you know, I could do the work. It all came back to me. I was at about 6 years. I had failed the qualifying exam. I said that, and that's, yeah, kind of brought me down. So I did whatever I had to do, was take the qualifying exam again, and then take the orals exam again. I have to say one thing about that orals exam. There were 2 sections. I had no idea what I was saying during that oral exam. I was on no drugs and no alcohol, and I was being questioned by 5 people, and I don't know what I said. And I went out after the first exam, and Arthur Vidich said, well, you did great, you passed it. I was like, he could have said I failed it, I wouldn't have known the difference. And then the second one, the same thing, he came out and said, well, you didn't do as well as the first one, but you passed it. So I got through that. So then it was time to write the dissertation. And the thing is about that see, I also never had a problem liking psychology, even though I studied sociology. I never really saw what was so alien about one thing to another thing. I knew you couldn't write it, and you could always end a sentence by saying, and this is much smarter than Freud would ever have said, and it would be like a good sentence. But I really felt that I had a psyche, and I had feelings, and I had an unconscious, and I was all this stuff. Although I understood sociology very well, somehow that kind of came natural to me. I think the reason for that is that I grew up in a really poor town where they had terrible neighborhoods. Every kid failed in school but me. And you can really see immediately the impact of an environment on a person. I mean, it was just so obvious. It just always made an impression on me. My main hobby was just walking around this slum all the time looking at it. So when there was a subject that says this means something, where you live and, you know, how it affects you, I just understood it immediately. So that was my introduction to sociology. So we have this dissertation now. And I was thinking, one of the reasons I went back was, I said, okay, since I'm going to this therapist, he's kind of showing me the negative things about being a barroom musician, which there were a lot of negative things, like people get drunk all the time and they cheat on their wives and husbands and they lose their money. And I said, yeah, you know, I can just show how this screws up people, like do an indictment on the bar business. So instead, he gives me an opposite problem. You know, I told him about what I was doing, and I wrote some things. He said, the real way to do this is, and I didn't have an opinion. I was very intimidated by authority figures. I was not one of these guys that talked to professors and stuff. They were just like, I'll tell you a little joke about that. When I got my degree, there was one other guy who had a degree with me, and Arthur Vidich said, well, you can call me Arthur now. And he says, oh, no. He said to me, he's still Dr. Vidich to me. You know, and I sort of felt the same way. So I never really told him. I just said this is what I was doing, and people were in these bars and drinking and having fun, and I'm playing in the band, I'm having fun. And he said, you should really show what they like about it. And I said, that's sort of the opposite of what I was thinking. And he said, I don't know really how to explain how you would do that. He said, you really have to bring out like what it feels like to be in there. You really have to get it on paper. The emotions that people are feeling in this place. And if you get on paper the emotions that people are feeling in this place, the reader will understand why they're there. And that's a good way to write up your specific thing. And what I really liked about Arthur Vidich was he really individualized this. He didn't have a preconception or some vested interest in some ideas. This, like apparently he was thinking, this would work here, and this would be the best thing. And apparently he could do this really well. You see, so he really has to be recognized as an outstanding teacher, and I believe he had a large number of people that he got dissertations for that were good dissertations. And, you know, there I was in this really, really remarkable situation with this person. So he said, I can't tell you how to do this. He said, you look at my, you know, you study a small town in mass society, but I don't think it's exactly what you're going to work with. And I looked at it and, you know, it wasn't really, didn't get a sense of crazy people in a saloon with a band playing loud, you know, and why they were there. So I'm the kind of person who I stumble into things. I don't make a lot of plans. Somebody told me that's what's called intuitive. You sort of wind up there, although you just follow some instinct, and then you're there, and then you're there. So I got through this dissertation, and he was a very cool advisor. He really was very uncritical of anything I wrote. He didn't. Apparently I knew what I was doing, and I was just writing it. And he would say, "Yeah, this is, you know, go ahead, keep going." And there was one point when I got stuck. I remember there was like a logical aspect of it, where which I was really grateful that he had that kind of analytical. But as a teacher, I have to say, he was really clear. You know, it was as if he took these ideas and he just chiseled them down so that you couldn't not understand them when you listened to him. Like Occam's razor, he was really like Occam's razor. He said the most profound thing in the simplest way, but it was still the most profound thing. And I had that honor of just sitting in these classes, the teacher I had before didn't talk like that. I never knew what they were saying. I would just take all these notes and try to unpack them. So that too, but I came to this point where these people in the bars would run into trouble. Their spouses would phone them. They wanted to know why they were there. They had all these things. So he got it. So it seemed to contradict the first thing about this being a great experience, because he noticed that I had to include that they did. He said, the way you get around this is you think of the alibis they give. And so I can't get it exactly now myself, but somehow the whole repertoire of rationalizations that they kept going to seem to fit with the piece without it contradicting. So they could have these problems, but the piece wouldn't run into a logical dilemma there. But I remember, like I said, I'm sorry I can't explain it that clearly, but he really got past that point. And that was the only point where I was actually stuck. But then we had one conference on that, and then that was that. And then I was done. Say one more thing about this dissertation. So I wrote it well enough where I understood that point of view. Like in other words, it succeeded at the level of this work convinced, at least whoever it had to convince, that people go in here to feel good and feel important and feel different than they do in their regular lives, and that was the idea. But I realized that's why I went there. So it was like this funny discovery that it was ultimately about myself as well. But I also found that out by writing in this way, by writing just like what the room looked like, what the floor looked like, things that an intellectual may look over because they're kind of trivial, but all these little things become important. A flower, I remember Hemingway has a line, glazed paper sacks, to describe like a little cookie inside of a little tiny plastic bag and all the time. All that stuff. In other words, writing it about playing music in clubs and these people, I realized that I felt exactly the same way. So that I found out about myself at another level through the writing, if that makes any sense. It's not the same as therapy. It's different than therapy. It's different. But anyway, he was like a great man in my life, is really what I have to say. I was just grateful to know him and to have him work with me. And as everybody else feels the same way. So, thank you.
couldn't make it last night because I would talk more on a personal level.
No, go ahead. This is all going to be videotaped, by the way.
Look at the camera.
And so it will include it in the video.
All right, I'll give him my best side.
Yeah, that works.
Some of the memories I have of Arthur was doing my dissertation under him. And we would meet Saturday mornings. They had the place in the village. And he'd offer me a cup of coffee and a roll. And then we got down to business. And I was very taken with a small town. So I had a million quotes from that study in my community study. And one fateful day, when I brought it to show it to him, took out this red pen, and he crossed out every quote from Small Town. He said, "This one's been done.
Yes.
Now you have to do your study."
What was your study?
It was a community study of a changing neighborhood in the city that was going from predominantly white to mixed, and then eventually turned into predominantly a black community. But he gave Joe and I a chance many years after school. He published he asked us to publish something in his community and identity. He always was very supportive. I remember going out later on when he was out in Southampton, he was at the place in Brooklyn. Always, what are you guys doing? What are you working on? What's going on in the school? And I teach at Adelphi, and we had a very dark period with a real anal cavity for a president who was almost destroyed the school. And we were trying to get him ousted. We had a committee that was raising money to pay two wonderful female lawyers who did most of their work pro bono, but it still cost us $650,000.
Oh my God.
And when he heard the story of what was going on there, he just took out his checkbook, said, "Who do I make this out to?" Because no one at a university should take control of a university from an administrative perspective. And the last point, because I think some of you would like to go to dinner.
Not yet.
Okay, then I'm here for the duration. Arthur, when I first met him, when I was first in his class, he intimidated me. I said, "Whoa."
Me too.
I'm not even going to talk to this guy. I'm going to hide out in the back. But he was one of the two faculty members there that really impacted on what I became as a sociologist. One was Carl Meyer, who was an expert in Max Weber. I remember sitting in his class. At this time, he was old, couldn't see too well, and his wife sat in every class because she had to drive him. And she was there semester in, semester out. And I asked her once, I said, "Don't you ever get tired of hearing the same stuff?" And she said, "It's never the same stuff." Still talking about Weber, still talking about social action, whatever. It's never the same stuff. Arthur had a different style. Karl Meyer was the European scholar. When he spoke, you listened. End of story. If you had any questions later, Arthur encouraged you to ask questions, encouraged you to question him. He loved seeing young people thinking things through. He wasn't there to convert. He was there to help us all become sociologists. And, you know, we all have our own style. But a lot of my style, I think, and I hope it is part of Arthur's style. Thank you.
Well,
but I want to talk about Joe Bensman as a college professor. I was lucky enough to be in the master's program in the fall of 1964 when he came to City College. I had just graduated from City College with a degree in sociology, and then I met Joe and my life changed. With all due respect to Art Vidich, who I never had as a professor, I never met anything like Joe. And he changed my life. I just want to go back to what 1964 looked like. Joe was coming to academia full-time after having worked, I think, at Syracuse and then for all that time in the advertising agency. And he didn't as much walk into the room as he sort of stumbled into it a little bit over, you know, those little ledges that you have. And when Joe lectured, he thundered. And I don't mean he bellowed. He thundered with conviction and belief and passion of the ideas that were in Goethe and in Weber. And after a while, you got to understand that the Goethe and Mills, and forgive this heavy-handedness, but the Goethe and Mills that I was looking for was from Max Weber, not social character and social structure, but you make do with what you got. All right. I began to realize, or at least believe, that was the truth. That was Weber. That was Marx. And it was really Joe. Joe's lectures could be transforming. And the one that I will remember all my life, and I don't even know what class it was in. It was toward the end of the class. And just let me give you an idea of what these rooms look like. They weren't like this. Wagner Hall had been a nun's dormitory. So Joe's office and the other offices were pods connected by bathrooms. And the rest were classrooms. And Wagner Hall was old. And the chairs were, you know, that old wood from public school. They didn't have the inkwells, but, you know, had that. And Joe suddenly switched to talking about the French writer Henri Balzac. And he ended by saying something about how Balzac showed you the rooftops of Paris. Well, I'd never been to Paris, and I still haven't, but I could see those rooftops. I really could. And then he said something that, I will never, ever forget. He said, art changes the way you see the world, and great art changes it forever. Okay, let me just repeat that. Art changes the way you see the world, and great art changes it forever. Joe also never used the words doing research. Mm-hmm. He never said, you know, you're doing research. He did say doing sociology, right? And before you knew it, you were doing a little bit of a study for the research methods course. And he had you present something about it. And all of a sudden, you were a congregant in the Church of Sociology, a small one, but a congregant nonetheless. Right? When he mentioned studies like Middletown, look familiar? You walked through those doors because you had to. Not because he was making you, but because you had to find out what was there. Right? I don't know very much about the religions of China. Robyn does. But he made Goethe and Weber come alive. Joe always started with some empirical reference to the world. I remember one time he was discussing the writing on tombstones on different sides of the railroad tracks to discuss social structure. And that was how he built it. He built it up like that. Later on, at the Graduate Center, classes were a little bit bigger, and Joe knew everyone in the room. He knew the research you were doing. He knew what made you tick. And when he got to a point in a lecture where it was about your interest or whatever, he looked at you, and you knew that he was talking to you. One of the remarkable things about him, and I always remember these particular quirks, to the best of my knowledge, he never used a calendar. I mean, if you can imagine running your life without a calendar, I mean, I can't. But he never missed an appointment. He always, knew when you were there. It always seemed so casual, and he just always knew it. The way in which work was carried around by him was in a little thing. He wore his watch upside down. Okay, that is, the 12 was here, the 6 was there, the 3 and the 9 were reversed. I noticed this one time, I think when I forgot my watch, and I was sitting near him and I could see it. And he said later that he wore it that way because he had worked as a printer, and he learned to read type upside down. And this was work in reality. He was more than a college professor. He was conviction. And he was a role model that you aspired to. And more than that, I really can't say. He just was unique, and those of us who were lucky enough to be there when he was rolling through those books and ideas after so many years got the benefit of it. Thank you.
I want to begin by thanking you, Jerry, for putting this conference on the legacy of Joe Bensman and Arthur Vidich together. It's obvious the amount of work you put into it, particularly from your challenging paper, which I loved, and all the other papers, which I'm not done with yet because they're intense. But particularly I want to thank you for asking me to be on this panel. For those of you who don't know me, I was a student, as I said. He was my mentor. And he was to me like an intellectual father, the one I did not have when I began to study the writings of Max Weber on my own as an undergraduate and then as a graduate student at Columbia. And I was there a long time before I came to the Graduate Center. Till I arrived at the Graduate Center. And so it's a privilege for me to be here today. That said, you asked me to speak on Joe Bensman's legacy. A little bit tomorrow I'll be talking about both. So I want to be clear about where I'm coming from, because I'm a little different than most of you. I'm a sociologist of science. As such, I've been involved in a longitudinal study attempting to establish sociology as a science. And I was when I came to the Graduate Center in 1979, when I found out that there was someone here, who might help me understand Weber better, read Weber, as I hoped he wished to be read in the present, past, and future tense for understanding what he was aiming to accomplish, because I was struggling. And since 1995, which is when I published my first book, The Essentials of Sociology, I've been engaged in a study of writing a book for that purpose, and also to be inclusive of Joe Bensman for a number of reasons, one of which is he was referring to me indirectly in one of his books, as he did all the time in his lectures, which is basically talking directly to his students as well, while presenting a lecture at the same time, which I find the most fascinating aspect of him as a teacher, to do both, two things at once. In his ways, he was talking to each one of us as individuals. There were so many times I would hear him and I said, he's talking to me about what I'm thinking about and concerned about me, so much that he would put me into his lecture. And he did this, from what I've been reading in his work, he didn't do it with me. He did it with other students as well. There was no hint of a hierarchy. It was always an exchange, although I took sociology so seriously that I never got to the point of considering him my friend. He was my mentor. He was practicing, from my point of view, a form of resistance to the bureaucratic idea of treating people dispassionately or in any other way than respectfully for the individuals we all are, including me, because I was a little odd. Yes, he was a marginal man, past tense, was. And that's in his last writing where in his biography. Did he mean it in the sense of, I'm not a marginal man anymore? I think he partially did. But I would argue not to us who learn from him, not only, he was a marginal man, but not to us, I should say, who learned from him not only of his breakout, because he, in his self-description, he talks about people coming to him to break out. The question to my mind is to break out of what? Break out of the hole he was in, of being perceived as an other than a sociologist. He was more than an advertising man, or man advertising Marilyn Bensman's part in his own development, which some of you referred to. And I think that's an interesting aspect which I have not explored. When he referred to the very sources of a man, a drama, or the dramatic aspect of his own development, its labor and capital-intensive aspects, he was not just thinking of advertising, at least I don't think so, but of social science, capital S, small s, and of how he might one day break out himself. That has become less marginalized. So when at least this is my interpretation. So when I read Bensman's thoughts on ethics, and the question came to my mind of how I might appropriately grant to him the propriety of scientific discovery, of which I think he deserves, and still is due, as far as the ideal type. He discusses that in Hans Gerth's contribution to American sociology, when he says, if the ideal type is true, then what are the implications of that? Because then it's no longer a theory. It's an understanding that's true. So I think he's due a great deal of respect and for his scientific discovery, which has been my concern, and that question of which he leaves open for the student whose work stood as his reference point. You can envision who I think that student might be. To the way to avoid that difficulty, or positively constructing a correct image of Gerth's contribution to American sociology.
First of all, to me, both Joe and Art had a real tremendous, a strong physical stature and a physical presence, which always impressed me. I mean, I learned that they were in the service. I don't know if Joe was also a Marine. I know Arthur was a Marine, but so they had that strength of presence, which not all my professors at Brandeis had at that point. A lot of them were older European emigres. My first experience with Arthur was I was intimidated by him. I was waiting outside a room in the Brown building, which was the social science building at Brandeis. The door opened, and this very powerful-looking guy who looked to me like an eagle, like a bald eagle. He came out of the room, just sort of reeling. He was like an angle. He was moving with such momentum that he didn't fall over. And so he came out of the room, passed us by, and I said, "Who is this?" You know, was he a full-time faculty member? And I only later learned, years later, when Jerry said to me, "You got to come to the New School and listen to some of Art Vidich's lectures." And I love this this situation of family and generations, because Jerry was a student of art, and when I was recuperating from back surgery in 1965, 66, I went to get a first master's degree at Adelphi University, where Arthur had found a job for Jerry. Jerry was my teacher. We became good friends. Then I started going to Arthur's classes, and then started studying with Arthur as well. But now I want to get back to Joe, I was privileged to take Joe's course at the New School Graduate Faculty of Sociology on Weber and bureaucracy. And it was a spectacular course. I had some difficulty with Weber, but as we know, Joe Bensman was a fantastic teacher. And over the time, we would have opportunity to sit in various cafeterias. This was quite a while ago, and I don't remember what years, but we used to sit in the cafeteria with Joe Bensman on the 11th Street building of the New School. So the way before Lane's department store used to call it a 14th Street education at Fifth Avenue prices, New School. And one of the things that Joe would talk to us about in terms of our lives and what we were doing, he was very proud of his children. He spoke to us about what each of you were doing. And I remember he said, you know, Laurin, you had a student who did a master's thesis about Brighton Beach. You really should meet Miriam, who is both a dancer, but also working, I think, if I'm correct or not, working with Russian immigrants in Brighton Beach. That was you? Rhea. Yeah, Rhea. Sorry, there you go. I need my memory assisted. Well, it was also a great pleasure for me over the recent years, until just a few years ago. I would go with Miriam Bensman to the Dissent magazine meetings when they were held in the basement of Jefferson Memorial Church. And we would have tea afterwards and enjoy the people that we knew for many years at Dissent. Joe would speak about how at a certain point, before World War II, during World War II, national leaders, if they had the opportunity, if there were the resources and the political support, could solve or resolve or bring certain national problems to a resolution. But after World War II, and we were internationalized and globalization was beginning, the problems of the world became too complex for any single leader to solve them. And this solving and resolution was not occurring. So what could a leader do? The best leaders could do nothing more than manage crises. And crisis management became one of the major ways in which we could evaluate a leader, a sine qua non crisis management. So those are a few comments I wanted to make about Joe, a spectacular experience, and I want to thank Jerry particularly for that marvelous paper that he's written that I'll be reading a great deal over the coming months and years. One story I heard was that when Arthur bought the place in Canada, Quetico, you said it was, one of the reasons that having seen the devastation of nuclear war in Japan, he wanted to try to bring the family to a place that would be safe. And one time when you were up there, he heard what turned out to be a flight over the area of Canada of the Strategic Air Command. And that general, what's his name, whose name I can't remember now, and he said, there's no escape, there's no place we can run to. We might as well go back to New York or wherever we were. Even the wilderness of Canada is not going to protect us. One time in one of his classes, not only I took a lot of his courses in the Fifth Avenue, 14th Street building, but some of these memories come from very large lecture halls in the old 11th Street building. I remember one time him speaking about, someone asked him about literature that Carl was talking about. He said, ultimately you may learn more from a novel than from a sociologist because of the way a novelist can get under the skin, what have you. He said, I would like to have been a novelist also. And if I were a better writer, I'd be a novelist. Meanwhile, I'm trying to do my best as a sociologist. I thought he was a brilliant, clear writer as well. And very often I say, what would Art Vidich say about this? What would Art Vidich, if only Art were alive now to confront these issues that we're living through. I remember him commenting this way, because one of my major interests is the sociology of art, sociology of culture, and he made some fantastic remarks about who rises or who gets attention and what forms and people producing what realms and experiences in art would get attention over the next few years. And he said, well, it's going to be African Americans, it's going to be Latinos, it's going to be women, it's going to be gay people. And this was, I don't know, in the late 60s, he was seeing this already. And it wasn't that he was so much predicting, but he was seeing the seeds of what would come about already coming up in the current social system. But no, Art Vidich was the one teacher who was most caring, most responsive, most engaged, and most helpful during my life as a student, more than any of these other people who had a certain mystique about them or a certain mythology around them. Art was the one who was there, helpful, and made emotionally and professionally the greatest impact upon me. And I always relied upon him coming to my graduate class at least once a semester. And someplace I would say to my students, "This guy's fantastic. Take notes." Nobody took notes. They listened. I took notes like I was still one of his students.
My name is Jamie Vidich. I am Arthur Vidich's grandson, the eldest son of his eldest son, Charles, not his eldest grandson. My grandfather, Arthur, had a very big influence on my life. Still does, I think I would say. He was always very encouraging. I've heard a lot of people talk about how generous he was. I would write him letters, and he replied to every letter that I ever wrote to him, which was one sign of his encouragement for me. The story that I want to tell you about is, I think, a story that reflects his influence on my life as well as his generosity and encouragement. When I was probably in middle school age, my cousin and I decided we wanted to start a newsletter, which he absolutely loved the idea so much that he gave me the names and addresses of all kinds of friends of his, including his collaborators and people who I may never have met, but whose names I knew so well just being in his household and eating at the dinner table with him. He really didn't separate his life as a grandfather or as a family man from his life as a sociologist, I think, because dinner conversations included discussion of topics related to his work as well as topics of interest to his family and of interest to, I would say, anybody who was a friend of him would have enjoyed his dinner conversations, I think. So he encouraged me with this newsletter idea, and a cousin of mine, Allie, and I got together and we wrote newsletters 4 times a year that we sent to people whose names we knew quite well, but whose faces we didn't know. Some of them I don't think I've ever met. Maybe I'm meeting tonight. So looking back at that, I think that just was a sign or an impact that he had on my life that was very powerful. That he was willing to open up his personal network to his grandson and trust that I would do what I wanted and do the right thing with the names of all kinds of people who I never met.
And one of the things that Art did when Jamie started it was called the Marsupial Press, by the way, James' newsletter. And Art agreed he not only promoted it in that way, but he also was an editor of it. I think Jamie sent him every issue first before it was mailed out, and he did his editorial.
He sent it back with all kinds of comments.
Right. So I'm going to share just a little bit about, just one, really small bit about Art and the family that I married into. And I'm also just want to say that how grateful I am for this evening. I mean, this is just wonderful. It's so sweet. And so everyone has been so generous with your stories, and it's all just really great. And I especially loved CJ's image of Art walking down the street with a Panama hat. You just feel like you're right with him. Anyway, one of the things that's kind of been a joke in our family is how Art raised his 4 sons. and Virginia, Art and Virginia both. There's a little joke around that really they would send the kids off and, you know, hope they would never come back. Because they had so much freedom. I've never even heard of a family who had as much freedom as the 4 boys had in the Vidich household. You know, they could do about anything, and they could just go anywhere in the world, and you know, at any age. And I think there's a story of Charlie going to the Amazon when he was 15 or 16 or something like that. Not only 15 or 16, but taking his younger brother Andrew, who was only 12, or how old? 12. And if you can imagine 2 young guys, I mean, a 12-year-old going off with his older teenage brother to the Amazon, and you know, they ran out of money, and they never got in touch with Art, and you know, they were down there. They had like $5 left or something like that, and had to get back to the U.S. and then hitchhiked back from Florida to New York or wherever they were living at the time. Anyway, when you think of that, you think of like just amazing sort of lack of care on the parents' side. But the reality is, I mean, from the moment I married into this family, I always felt like Art was just such a father figure to me. He just took I think all of you 4 guys' wives under his wing, and he made us his daughters right away. I mean, he cared about every aspect of our lives. He questioned us. He deeply cared about our children and, you know, what they were up to, and he was always inquisitive about all of it, and knew what was going on, and remembered, you know, what to ask about. And so I just have this one little story that I want to end with, and it has to do with when Jamie went off to college. And Jamie went off. We drove him up, and we came back home to Connecticut, and he was going to school in Boston. And when we got home, Art called later that evening, and he talked to me, and you know, I was in tears because it was my first, you know, nest flight. And so Art just was so sweet, and he said, you know, he said, well, how are you doing? And I just said, oh, I'm just miserable. He's gone. You know? And Art said, don't worry. You think they're going away forever, but the reality is you can never get rid of them.
I want to relate a couple of anecdotes that come to mind listening to some of Art's family speak. First, you know, like Ira, I want to change Art's hat from the Panama hat. I came to the New School in the mid-'70s from Western North Carolina. And prior to that time, I had never been in a big city before, except for one brief trip down to Atlanta with my father to see Henry Aaron play baseball.
You were a real hippie. I remember.
I was a genuine, honest-to-God hillbilly with all of the cultural sophistication that term implies, right? Came to New York, and the first time I met Art Vidich, he was wearing that maroon beret. And to me, that hat represented the absolute height of cultural sophistication. And somehow in my mind, it still kind of represents the height of intellectual sophistication. That's the first thing. So it's not the Panama hat for me, it's that beret.
Raincoat.
Yeah. The second story, I think, illustrates Arthur's generosity of spirit. After I left the New School, I got a job in Minnesota, moved out there, and of course Art and I continued to talk frequently. We did some collaboration. And then my wife and I had a daughter. That's not connected to the collaboration with Art, but you know, we had a daughter. And when she was 4 and 5 years old, of course, anytime the phone rang, it had to be for her, because who would call me? And so she would rush and grab the phone, and it was frequently, it'd be Art. And they would have a conversation that would go on for 15 and 20 minutes. She'd never met him at all. She would relate her 4 and 5-year-old obsessions to him, and he would take her absolutely seriously, treat her as, a full-scale human being, almost as an adult. And I tell you, she absolutely adored this man. She is now 29 years old and still remembers her conversations with Art. If I were lucky enough to get to the phone first, Art and I would be talking. My daughter would come over and say, "Is that Art Vidich? Is that Art Vidich? I want to talk to him." And I would, say, no, honey, I need to talk to him. And Art would always say, no, put her on. This is far more important than anything you and I have to talk about. He was incredibly generous with his time and spirit with my daughter, and she remembers.
I knew you.
So
I knew you.
The back, I saw the back. I didn't see the front.
I knew you.
God.
Nice to see you.
I know. And I wrote a paper on Marx, and comes to my mind the humanistic aspect of Marx. And in the book I'm writing, found out that Marx changed his mind about Marxism. And I think it's that critical eye that you're describing that did it. I have a trademark, and it has an eye in it, which I put on my card. My husband's an artist, so I had him do it for me because I just thought it was so good, And in writing this book, have come to know, which is bothersome to me, that my work will never end. I could go on and on and on with my critical eye of self-doubt or doubt, fundamental doubt. That's what I think it is. And it will never end. And so I, this past week, decided, that's it. I'm stopping. I can't do anymore because it's never ending. So I do think, and I got this in your class, and it has helped me in a variety of ways, because I thought Marx was, he appealed to me on a humanistic level, just on so many ways. So I appreciate your question. I think it's fundamental doubt. Is that critical eye.
Fundamental doubt.
Fundamental doubt, which is Weber's idea. Fundamental doubt is the father of knowledge. Necessity is the mother of invention. And one of the things that I've learned in my work is the role of women in science, which has been clearly ignored, partly as a result of the Protestant ethic and the way, women are emotional. So anybody who's emotional can't do science, they can't do reason and all that stuff. So I appreciate the question. And I must admit, I'm really happy to see you.
Thank you both. So,
in which the United States and its bureaucratic, governmental, and corporate organizations dominate global society and maintain their power through the administration of a Keynesian compromise. This compromise, which is primarily between the government and the corporations, but includes lesser social institutions and classes as well, attenuates or softens the conflicts and inequalities which threaten to undermine the world system. I'll make one comment here, which is there's another compromise which I think isn't described, which is the compromise between the financial sector and the rest of the economy, which has broken down, and I don't think it was given enough prominence in the New American Society. In the revised edition of the American Society, which was published in 1987, the authors depict the decline of that world system. They place its origin in around 1965 and describe the weakening of American hegemony, the attack by corporations on the terms of the Keynesian compromise, the revolt by minorities, youth, and women whose rising expectations were not being met by the compromise, and the growth of new cultures and lifestyles in post-Golden Age America that did not conform to the bureaucratic ethos of the previous 20 years. Let me comment. There's one other thing which I left out of the first paragraph, which is that their analysis of the bureaucratic society was not gendered and did not take into account the degree to which the bureaucratic organizations and the new American society marginalized women. And I think that was a definite failing or weakness of the analysis. And it's also related to some of the changes that I'm going to get into. When I reread these pages from the 1987 edition in preparation for this conference, I could not help but feel that this analysis was remarkably on point. However, when I looked at section 4 on new social structures and political forces in American life, it seemed to me that the analysis was also flawed. This section acknowledges the contradictions that grew within the Keynesian world system between the bureaucratic, corporate, and government organizations with their authoritarian pressures and the educational system that produced the organization then. Bensman and Vidich argued that this contradiction expressed itself in the cultural sphere, but not in the workplace. Because bureaucratic organizations were able to enforce conformity at the office, but had learned to allow diversity at home. And I guess the main point I'm going to make is I don't think that that has remained static. I think that the undermining of the bureaucratic ethos has penetrated the office now. When you look at American society in a global context today, I think it is clear that the bureaucratic, corporate, and organizational and governmental organizations of the golden age of the Keynesian compromise are giving way to networked organizations powered by digital technologies. Maybe that's too strong a statement, but that's how I was inspired to write a couple days ago. Global supply chains are different from IBM. Apple has 50,000 employees out of a global workforce of 500,000. Many of the functions once performed by bureaucratic managers at IBM in the 1960s are today performed by contracted firms in Apple's network. So the workers, there are fewer workers in the bureaucratic organizations, and the workers are not employees anymore. They're not employed, they're contracted workers. Human resources, accounting, logistics, manufacturing, quality control, legal services are all often contracted out to firms that are mired in fierce competition and so are unable to provide job security to the staff. Careers no longer take place within one organization. Employment is not to be taken for granted, and it is not normalized. Within Apple's core, the 50,000 engineers, web designers, online marketing strategists, etc., think of themselves as free agents rather than members of a corporate bureaucracy. They change jobs, start their own businesses, negotiate their work schedules and workplaces. They think of themselves as entrepreneurs of themselves. When the markets are on an upswing, they proclaim that they have transcended subordination and wage slavery. When the markets slump, they complain about precarity and the holes in the social safety net. Only the wise ones have learned to save money to sustain themselves during downturns in the markets. In short, not only have the bureaucratic organizations of the 1960s been challenged or given way due to the decline of the Keynesian world system, but the bureaucratic work ethic of the 1960s has given way to a free agent work ethic, which incorporates many of the cultural criticisms of bureaucracy that academics and radical students gave voice to in the 1960s. I am emphasizing this point because while I have been doing my study on the decline of employment and the precarization of work, I've come to appreciate that the bureaucratic work ethic that Bensman and Vidich took for granted was not historically the dominant strain in Americans' view of work and employment. As corporate America began building bureaucratic organizations in the early 20th century, they developed systems of work and management that provided some rewards to loyal employees, and out of this compromise, a bureaucratic work ethic was born and lasted into the 1970s. There were also strains, however, between the regimentation and pressures of conformity contained within the bureaucratic work ethic and the American hostility to subordination. Some of Bensman's best writing described how bureaucratic employees resisted their subordination through political game playing, sabotage, etc. However, by the 1970s, more and more white-collar workers were college-educated, and they had learned ways of thinking and living that conflicted with the conformity dominated by corporate bureaucracies. Moreover, millions of women entered these bureaucracies, which had been designed with men in mind, and they chafed and rebelled at the way that the organizations marginalized them. By the 1980s, as the Keynesian world system cracked in the vise of internal and external pressures, the cultural rebelliousness which Bensman and Vidich had analyzed as stemming from the student radicals in the 1960s and had predicted would remain outside of the bureaucratic workplace began to challenge the bureaucratic work ethic. Now here, let me add one other thing, which is it wasn't only internal to the bureaucracies that the revolt happened, but it was also that employers no longer kept the promises that they had been making in the organizations described in the new American society, but they began to lay people off, downsize, contract out, outsource, etc. And so it began to be hard for people to believe that there was any reason to be loyal to the bureaucratic organizations when the organizations weren't being loyal to them.
Small point of appreciation. Robyn mentioned the tap, and it strikes me that the aesthetics of sociology that Joseph Bensman practiced had to do with locating the telling detail. Yeah. And the telling detail is an aesthetic presentation of a minutia which reflects, the entire, in this case, a phenomenology of the relationship among workers, between workers and middle-level management, and between those two and higher-level management. And I was thinking of this because my own father worked for General Electric and in manufacturing jet engines, and they kept what they called jigs, and these facilitated the process of welding, but they kept this from management because they knew that management would immediately work this into the cost timetable, and so they, for their own benefit, they hid this. So it's this idea that, which Bensman captures, I think, extremely well, that there is a class warfare going on, and it's very complicated, and there's collaboration, but it's very much an aware, a class-aware struggle. Thanks.
I just want to say about the participant observation process. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year is not enough to get into and understand a community like Candor. You have to be there for a while. And I think the fact that he was there for 3 years, I think the fact that he had his wife working, and by the way, she did a lot of the interviews. There were 6 people doing the interviews. And how do I know this? Because it's all in the Candor newspaper stories about how this was done. I mean, I do remember some things, but believe me, there's only certain things I can remember from that period. So he had a wife. She's a nice lady. He had 2 children. and he had a dog. So, you know, what more can you ask for in a rural town? You know, it looks like he's like everybody else. So he fit in, and all of that had a lot to do with his acceptance in the community. And then, of course, there were 4 other researchers, you know, connected with the project. And then, of course, there's the technical side. Aside from participant observation, what made it interesting to me was that my father worked with Mr. Shapiro, who did the statistical work. I don't know if you've read his stuff, but he did the statistical work. And there was always the question, how valid is participant observation when you've got a bias, individual people trying to steer you into their point of view, and there's nothing standard about these things. Even if you have a standard questionnaire, there's a lot of potentials for bias that exist. Of course, you can argue that the same issue with a survey, there's biases in that regard. So what they did, and if you're familiar with it, is that they did both methods, and they actually published the results of the 2 methods. And what was interesting is that they actually correlated, and mostly because of the enormity and the depth of detail of participant observation work that they had done. They had done 600 interviews, which is an enormous number of interviews. If you look at White's study of street corner society, there was nothing like that. There was I mean, he was a universe of one. It's basically what it was. So what you end up with is an entirely different thing. So it's a very unique study of the value of participant observation, but only in the context of a longer period of analysis, 3 years. And also when you had a team of people doing this. One person could not have done 600 interviews. It took a team of 6 individuals, and it took a team of male and female to make this happen, because there's no way that one person, gender, you can argue, is not an issue. It is always an issue. Race is an issue. All of these are issues. So how do you deal with it? You blend your team of participant observers in such a way that you reflect the people you're working with so that you get beyond some of those issues. That has to be done. And I think that was part of the masterful part of this study. You know, and I have to give credit to the other 5 participant observers who really were not given as much credit as they should have for what they did. But, so that's one thing. The other thing has to do with looking at this issue of maturity of observation. And when I say that, there's certain things that don't happen on a daily basis or weekly or monthly or yearly basis. In fact, there are some plants that only flower every 40 years. Now, if you take that analogy and you put it in the social world or the political world, there's some phenomena that don't happen on the periodicity where you can just say, I've been here for 1 year, I've seen what's happened. There's certain things that are like a threshold event that must happen before you actually can observe those things. So I think to some extent, the participant observation experience in small town benefited from that 3 years of immersion. You know, you could argue that a few more years might have been helpful, but it was 3 times more than the 1 year that you saw in many other cases. So in any case, what I'm trying to say is you get a concern here with time as being an important variable when there's cycles of activity that are otherwise not seen if you're not there for a long enough period of time. One other point I'd make too, motivation. In the surveys, and my father made this point, you don't necessarily get motivation out of a census. You can kind of ascribe motivation to surveys, but you don't get a first-hand account of why somebody thinks some way. And so from a historiography point of view, having a participant observer role in which you can ask people specifically, why did you do this? How did this happen? Those types of things are much more fruitful than relying on surveys alone. It's not that a survey should not be used. Surveys have a tremendous value. But the richness of participant observation and the ability to get to history, of the mind and the history of the past is only possible by having that kind of role. And interestingly enough, during this whole period in small town, that period, there were more stories in the Candor Courier about the history of candor than any other period. It was like they knew my father wanted to know the history. So all of a sudden, the Chamber of Commerce is writing the stories, everything they did for the last 50 years. I said, my God, isn't that something? They were just like, and this was partly in the role of participant observation, trying to, there's an expression of the observers affecting the observed, because they want to help you get what you're looking for. And so what are you looking for? Well, darned if I know what I'm looking for. And then, and they changed their view. But so there was a whole period in that where everyone was writing the history of this, the history of that, and they're all front page stories in the Candor Courier. But the Candor Courier was like a 4-page paper. So there, anything of importance was on the front page. So it was a very interesting thing to see, reading through the Candor Courier, how they were trying to help the Springdale Project with information. But the one thing I will say in conclusion, though, is that my father felt that the most difficult thing was going to another country and trying to learn their culture and all of their values, because everything would be brand new. And while I understand that point, and I appreciate that point, I think in many ways his work in candor might have even been more difficult, because what happens is you have this, you're in your own culture, so to speak, and so all your cultural reference points are exactly the same as the people you're observing. But are those cultural reference points that you're observing and they're observing the same understandings about those cultural reference points? Do you still see them, you as an urban kid from Milwaukee versus people grew up and who've never been out of the town of Candor, which is, 30 miles from nowhere. And so even though they seem like it might be easier, the problem with being a participant observer in your own society is that you have to constantly question your assumptions, because you just think that I understand. When you're in another culture, you automatically understand that you don't know. And so it's a question of recognizing that. And I think my father understood it to some extent, but in his articles about Paul Radin, he didn't say it that way. And I felt that I needed to explain, from my point of view, that particular difference and concern I had with participant observation within your own culture. So I'll leave it at that.
What did arise in opposition to economic oligarchy and the attack on the social safety net, on economic diversity, and I'm speaking of diverse economic systems around the world, which of course have been mercilessly attacked, and the environment, was youth, a subset of the population denied a future under the direction of current trends, yet neither co-opted nor pacified or in pacified despair. Now, I want to just quickly mention something about what I consider a pattern. We are now facing, of course, a rampant drug addiction problem with pharmaceuticals, a deliberate profit center promoted around addictive substances, something that Al Cap in his comic strip predicted 30 years ago as a direction for American business. But this only comes after the U.S. transformed the Afghanistan economy into a drug factory, transformed the Mekong Delta into a drug factory, gained control of the Colombian drug pipeline. So we have to understand, I think, that the addictive direction of the American economy, that addictive component of production, has to be in relationship to the actual decline in opportunities, to the despair in the Rust Belt, to the despair in Appalachia, to the despair in the inner city. This is a deliberate attempt to soak up, to sop up, to essentially paralyze with despair the surplus population. I attempt to illustrate this argument, certainly not prove it, through a participant study of politics in Burlington, Vermont. I won't say participant observer because I did my darndest to shape political events. But the engagement was its own kind of research. In a nutshell, Bernie Sanders, with a youthful leftist support, introduced and institutionalized a series of reform initiatives as mayor in the 1980s. Housing, urban agriculture, biking as a transportation alternative, neighborhood planning assemblies. This progressive coalition that continued into the new century failed by 2012, proving incompetent and morally compromised. A business developer coalition roared back into power in 2012 and implemented a municipal vision of the neoliberal agenda. The opposition force, headed really by a group called Coalition for a Livable City, has been comprised of aging 60s and 70s in-migrants, subsequent in-migrants who were attracted to this notion of Burlington as the People's Republic. And it has not included established institutions as such, the University of Vermont, Champlain College, major businesses, or Bernie-era nonprofit housing trusts, or social justice organizations. So far, the neoliberals have won nearly every contest. They have, I'll just focus on one, which is the airport housing issue. Of course, we have a Air National Guard posted in the municipal and civilian airport in Burlington. Or actually, it's in South Burlington because it's slightly less urbanized. And that the noise factor has caused the airport to garner $54 million in FAA funding to buy and demolish surrounding houses at a time of housing scarcity. And that has now reached 200 houses. There is at least 960 houses that are in the zone, and likely to be many more because we're bringing in the F-35, which is 4 times louder than the present F-16. So we have an interesting local connection to the industrial military complex, which the Democratic Party and the Progressive Party have not been able to challenge, nor has Bernie Sanders. Other victories of the neoliberals has been busting zoning in the urban core, numerous public subsidies for private corporate enrichment, a dynamic called TIF, tax increment financing, which is a scam of the Republicans, which has been embraced by the Democrats, which allows all of the tax increments on a new development to go to the bondholders and not to go to the schools and not to go to the municipal budget until the bond is paid off. And so it is presented to the public as sort of a tax-free way to encourage development because your immediate taxes don't go up. But there's been a few victories. The new middle class, in fact, did kind of rise from its lethargy and defeat a neighborhood parking plan, which was to allow parking for businesses to be in neighborhoods surrounding the business core. Defeated housing in the industrial district, which would have simply gentrified it. And there's a bunch of issues that we have taken to court. An unnecessary parkway and a skyscraper development.
There are 3 universities in the area and, a fairly substantial number of people who would be referred to as progressive. And they never have a chance on anything. Anytime the business community wants something, they get it. If anything promises to increase business traffic, raise revenue, tax revenues, it passes, pure and simple. And that even means whenever there is serious criticism of the business community, somehow they're able to co-opt it. And I can give you several concrete illustrations of this. Where I grew up, near Asheville, North Carolina, this is the home of Thomas Wolfe. Wolfe wrote Look Homeward, Angel, which is kind of a searing indictment of the upper business class of Asheville. And for quite a long time, he was very much persona non grata there. So much so that his second book is called You Can't Go Home Again. But today, you can take tours and go by and see the angel of the first book's title. It's on a tombstone in a local cemetery. And they have reclaimed Thomas Wolfe as a favorite son because there are commercial opportunities associated with it. Where I live in Minnesota, I'm about an hour and a half away from Sauk Center, Minnesota, which was the hometown of one Sinclair Lewis, who wrote Main Street and Babbitt, and very, very critical of, especially the Main Street business community and sort of stultifying small-town atmosphere of small-town America. And they despised him when I first moved out to Minnesota. You better not mention Sinclair Lewis's name. They have subsequently rebuilt the entire Main Street. They advertise themselves as the original Main Street of America, and are, the business community is attempting to make all sorts of money off Sinclair Lewis. In Asheville today, when I was growing up there, many years ago, it was redneck heaven. It was redneck heaven. And since I've moved away, there have been a lot of people moving into the area, moneyed, middle class and moneyed people going there to retire for the climate. It now has a huge arts community and gay community. There were no gay people when I was growing up. That they didn't exist. In fact, Asheville is often referred to now as the gay mecca of the East Coast. All of which, of course, completely drives the indigenous folk in the area completely crazy. Because what's happened, of course, is the tax base, tax rates have gone up. A lot of those working class people, which almost includes my family, are being driven out because they simply can't afford to pay the taxes. And so you have a really substantial progressive element in the Asheville area now. And the business community has completely embraced it because they have opportunities to make money off of it. Asheville hosts music and arts festivals, gay pride parades. There have even been a few topless protests against misogyny in the town square. My 15-year-old nephew and his friends became fierce opponents of misogyny at that time. My point is simply that progressive elements themselves can be easily co-opted by business and neoliberal factions. And, the business community always wins. I appreciate the resistance that you put up in Burlington, but sorry, it didn't work out. Switching topics, I want to say just a few things about the new middle classes. The cultural enemy in social psychology of the new middle classes has really ominous potential, I think, in the realm of politics. The new middle classes, Art and Joe pointed this out. I've worked with it in a different way. This is a stratum that lacks stable cultural standards, and as a result can't be expected to hold a deeply held political philosophy that's able to consistently define political values against which any sort of issue that comes up can be measured. And so their political commitments tend to be determined largely by their economic self-interest in sustaining a middle-class way of life and certain style of consumption on which their sense of social and self-esteem rests. That has been very difficult to do over the years. In 1982, I think it was, I published this essay on the emergence of conservatism at that time. And one part of it made reference to the new middle classes and this lack of civic philosophy in the sense that, traditionally the new middle classes were champions of welfare state liberalism. But as soon as their economic self-interest started to be threatened by economic decline and the like, they totally abandoned that in favor of political developments that would return some kind of economic monies to them. So what was a Proposition what in California? What was it? 13, which reduced their taxes. And of course, the people who are going to suffer most when you start cutting taxes are the disadvantaged elements of society. Many of these folks went for Reagan, who promised them a 30% across-the-board tax cut. And it wasn't just in politics. I mean, they started to make adjustments in other areas, too. This is a time in which more women in the family were going off to work because it was much more difficult for a single income earner to sustain that middle-class way of life. And we tended not to see that as an act of desperation because it also coincided with the cultural movement, the women's movement. And then, of course, later still, they just started going into serious debt in order to maintain that middle-class way of life, and many suffered when the housing market broke. On conservatism, I feel like I have to say something about Trump, who's not really a conservative but plays one on television. I've read a lot of material lately about how the factor that led to Trump's presidential election is economic uncertainty on the part of, lots of people out there. I don't quite buy that. If economic uncertainty were the real issue, then blacks and Hispanics should have gone for Trump overwhelmingly because they face a lot more economic uncertainty than white people do. And the reality is, middle class and working class white people really did overwhelmingly go for Donald Trump. Charles made reference to identity politics, and there are a lot of reasons why identity politics have become a dominant feature of American political culture today. The successes of the civil rights movement have something to do with that, as blacks and others who emulated the success of blacks began to use identity itself as a criterion for the distribution of whatever social resources are available, that sort of thing. And if I can put this in Art and Joe's terms, the federal government began to attempt to co-opt various groups of people, racial, ethnic, gender, other groups, by offering various kinds of legislation and substantive benefits. Something like affirmative action clearly is a benefit to particular groups and so forth. And that worked to some degree. But from the point of view of a lot of the white working and middle classes out there, the government and other institutions are essentially attempting to co-opt the wrong people. They felt left out in all of this. They were not being recognized in all of this. And the result was to make them extremely defensive, resentful, because in their minds they're the true Americans, the rightful heirs of the American dream. And whenever they voiced any kind of opposition to, in general terms, identity politics, they tended to get slapped down with the moralism of political correctness, which of course made them all the more resentful. And Trump recognized these groups of people. He told them that they were important. He validated their resentments against others who they see as undeserving of governmental largesse.
I've been trying to come to terms with what I consider to be the Bensman-Vidich collaborative legacy. And I meant to write a much more ambitious paper than I did. I had to focus on very narrow because in trying to come to terms with the Bensman legacy, it took me 7 months of really difficult work that didn't leave me much time. But I will say what I've been trying to argue in this paper is that Vidich and Bensman provided in their two books, Small Town and Mass Society and American Society, the Welfare State and Beyond, and in their interlinking articles, two interconnected insights which are especially relevant today. One, they anticipated the rise of the nativist movement, which would support all and confirm all of the political developments we see today. And related to that, they saw the beginnings of and anticipated the demise of what they call the Keynesian bargain, a double pianissimo version of social democracy in which everybody gained something. The upper classes gained the most, the new middle classes gained some, the blue-collar working class gained some, and the welfare classes gained very little. And that's actually been challenged by Gabriel Kokol and others, but I won't go into that. And so what I would argue, as Veblen argues in his books, is that the very consumption addictions of the middle classes and all classes that aspire to middle class respectability has what Joe Bensman would call an institutional logic that eventually leads to what we see today. Because, as Mike pointed out, when push comes to shove, when the addictions are not provided, people will almost do anything to protect them. And you could do an analysis of every class and how, and it really corresponds to what happened in Nazi Germany, when the expectations are cut off, reduced. Of course, for the lower classes, the oppression is the most real, but for every class, the psychological consequences of losing some of what you have makes people fundamentally irrational. So, I think I'm trying to argue, and here, you know, I'll veer off a little bit into the discussion. I agree with much of what Charles Simpson has to say, not about the Bensman-Vidich ability to anticipate or address that in the time they had, but in the results. And this comes from the great tradition of not only the Frankfurt School, but the New Left historians, William Appleton Williams, Noam Chomsky, Gabriel Kokol, Chalmers, Veblen, all of these people we've read, we've absorbed, but I don't see a great tension between the Vidich-Bensman analysis and that analysis, particularly if you take into account the psychological repercussions that they describe in the social psychology of the various classes they portray in Small Town Mass Society, the New American Society, their articles, Bensman's independent articles, the articles that Authur wrote after Joe's death, in which he chronicled in some detail the despair of youth. I think he starts it off in the last essay in the anthology in the New Middle Classes, doesn't he? Yes. Okay. Yeah, and so that Authur was very, very aware of what the victory of neoliberalism and the demise of Keynesianism was doing to youth. And I don't think that his attitudes towards youth was totally set by those tumultuous times at the New School, where the radical youth blew themselves up in the neighborhood. He was fully aware. He had read Barry Laffin's book about Vermont, which gives the most complex, intricate analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the counterculture in Vermont. To some extent, they were possibly biased because they were upwardly mobile sons of immigrants for whom you did not go off and you were expected to take advantage of the opportunities you gave, and if you were going to move up, you worked hard. So I think it's an open question of to what extent they, and all analysis is limited, incomplete, they were able, in anticipating the irrationality that we see today, that they feared was coming and wrote about as early as 68 and 71 and 75. And I think both of them, and especially Bensman, in his essay included in the anthology on the crisis of confidence in contemporary politics, Joe was fundamentally aware of the resentment and rage that was developing in all social classes and where this would lead, and how the inability to diffuse the cycle, which is even greater today, of resentment, of broken promises, that leadership, you cannot be successful. Charles Simpson is not the only one who has tried to intervene in Vermont politics. I was a candidate for U.S. Senate in the Liberty Union Party 7 times. That you cannot, unless you make these promises, you cannot succeed. There is a kind of institutionally enforced means of success which you have to attune yourself to.
I'll just start with one thing. Self-delusions can go really, really deep. The new middle classes certainly continue to entertain the hope that they can maintain a middle-class way of life despite, pressures that say otherwise. Over the last 40 years, middle-class wages have been pretty much stagnant, right? And they have kept looking for ways out of that. I can't tell you at what point, substantial portions of that stratum start to realize that things are not going to go their way. And I can't tell you what the response would be once they do realize that. Because, like we were talking about with Art and Joe, I don't think any of us get that crystal ball. And the irrationality that's part of American political culture makes it even more unpredictable, I think. But, on Trump, I was having similar kinds of sentiments as the ones you just expressed. And all along the way of that election, I kept arguing with people because, I've done studies on nativism. This is not the first expression of nativism in American history. At different times, we've been anti-Catholic, anti-Freemason, anti-Jew, anti-communist, right? This is just the most recent expression. And, you can't help but recognize that strain in American life. And so I would argue with people who would say, oh, he has absolutely no chance because listen to the bigotry, listen to what he says. And my response to that was also, yeah, that's why he has a chance. He is appealing to people out there precisely on that basis. Now, I didn't think that he could actually pull it off, but I always thought his support, was that nativist support. And that is a deeply irrational strain in American political culture.
Part of the relevance and enduring qualities and beauty of their work is that they did not propose solutions. That they, as best they could, described things the way they were, why they were that way in enough ethnographic and historical detail so that we as human beings could see what they saw. And I think they would be frankly amused if we were to end this conference by attempting to propose solutions. It did not mean that they did not believe in solutions. It did not mean that they, I think they believed that endless search for understanding may lead to solutions, but I think it would be counterintuitive to end a conference coming to terms with what they intended by proposing solutions. I would say personally, the joy and hope that I get out of reading their work and what little contribution I can make is that the search for reality and the understanding of things as they are and being able to anticipate, not predict, not describe, but anticipate as they did, is a way in which we individually and collectively can make decisions, grapple with our future, understand politics, and act. But I don't think they believed that the function of sociology was to provide solutions. The purpose of sociology was to help us to understand so that we could then perhaps find solutions.
Decided when I woke up this morning that I wanted to say a few words about my father, about a topic that hasn't been mentioned here, at least not overtly. In 1970, my father was diagnosed with multiple myeloma at the age of 48. He had been experiencing back pain and then one day just collapsed. My mother told us that the doctors gave him 2 to 5 years to live. This was before newer treatments like thalidomide and stem cell treatments were known. My father wasn't told of this prognosis, but he made a remarkable recovery. He was in remission twice, with 2 more relapses over the 16 years he survived. The last year he was in a wheelchair. Joe never talked about being sick or dying, though he would complain about being tired and in pain. Throughout those 16 years, he never gave up on his writing and teaching. Yes, he did keep smoking, but I think his pervasive denial was one of the reasons he was able to survive emotionally and continue his amazing productivity. He had such a strong passion, as Mike Givant said, and such a need to express his theories and thoughts and creative mind. My sister Miriam, a very talented writer, as is my brother David, eloquently pointed out to me that just as you all gained so much from Joe as a sociologist and have been expressing your gratitude, my father gained so much from you all. A purpose and tremendous comfort that increased his will to live and survive those 16 long years, in addition, of course, to his love and loyalty to his family. My brother wanted to add that in the years after my father got sick, he was able to flourish and take advantage of life in many new ways. My parents moved into the city, and he loved roaming Central Park and visiting cafes and restaurants with his friends and colleagues, denying the impending threat of death. When he complained to Miriam about the doctor's or hospital's mistakes, he elaborated a theory of the sociology of healthcare rather than feeling like a victim. He never complained about his fate as a cancer patient. Our family believed that he got the myeloma from his exposure to the atomic bomb tests he was near during the war, when he worked in Los Alamos and Texas as an Army mechanic and electrician on airplanes. But he never bemoaned his fate. And for this strength, I admire him as much as for his amazing contributions as a sociologist. And I would like to think that this strength and will to live can be an inspiration to all of us in that way. And Miriam and David read these comments and approved of this message.
Well,
and with this wonderful statement, thank you so much. The conference ends.